When medieval chroniclers described the Mongols, they did not begin with numbers. They began with dread. Riders appeared on the horizon like a shifting shadow, banners snapping in the wind, dust clouds rising behind them. Cities that had stood secure for centuries fell in weeks. Armies larger and better armored were scattered in a single afternoon. To those who faced them, it did not seem like a conventional invasion. It felt like inevitability. Yet the Mongols did not begin as an unstoppable empire. In 1206, when Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan at a great assembly of tribes, he ruled not cities, but horsemen. The transformation that followed was not driven by brute strength alone. It was driven by perception. As Mongol campaigns against the Jin dynasty in northern China intensified after 1211, stories traveled along trade routes faster than the cavalry itself. Merchants whispered of annihilated garrisons. Refugees spoke of towns erased. Rumor magnified reality, and fear began to move independently of the army. By the time Mongol riders approached new borders, many defenders believed resistance was already futile. Power may have broken walls, but fear opened gates. And once that fear took root, conquest accelerated beyond anything the medieval world had ever witnessed. Long before fear became their weapon, the land itself forged the men who would wield it. The Mongolian steppe was vast and merciless, an open expanse of grasslands where survival depended not on fortifications or harvest stores, but on movement. Winters froze the earth solid, summers scorched it dry, and resources shifted with the seasons. To endure in such a place required constant adaptation. Families migrated with their herds, living in felt yurts that could be dismantled and moved at a moment's notice. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. The horse was not simply transportation, it was livelihood, protection, and identity. By adulthood, a Mongol warrior could guide his mount with his knees alone, leaving his hands free to draw a composite bow capable of piercing armor at remarkable distances. Before 1206, the steppe was fractured by rival tribes locked in cycles of alliance and betrayal. Warfare was frequent, but it was small in scale and deeply personal. Loyalty followed bloodlines. Leadership rose and fell with reputation. When Temujin united these tribes and was proclaimed Genghis Khan at the Kurultai, he did more than claim authority, he dismantled the tribal order that had limited the steppe's potential. He reorganized his people into a decimal military structure, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Men from different clans were deliberately mixed, weakening old loyalties and strengthening allegiance to central command. Promotion depended on merit and reliability, not noble birth. Discipline became absolute. If one soldier deserted, his entire unit could be punished. Trust was enforced by shared consequence. This restructuring transformed scattered warriors into a synchronized force. Communication flowed through flags, horns, and mounted couriers. Units could separate across miles of open terrain and reunite seamlessly. What outsiders mistook for chaotic motion was controlled precision. The Mongols' mobility was not improvisation, it was habit refined into doctrine. Their speed, endurance, and discipline allowed them to appear where enemies believed no army could travel. In time, that unpredictability became terrifying. The steppe had shaped them into masters of movement. Genghis Khan gave that movement purpose. And once direction combined with discipline, fear became inevitable. The true power of Mongol fear was first demonstrated not in distant Europe, but in Central Asia. In 1218, a caravan of Mongol merchants and envoys arrived at the borders of the Khwarezmian Empire, seeking trade and diplomatic recognition. Instead, they were arrested and executed on the orders of Shah Muhammad II. To many rulers, such an incident might have provoked a punitive raid or limited retaliation. To Genghis Khan, it justified something far greater. In 1219, Mongol forces began a coordinated invasion that would dismantle one of the most powerful Islamic empires of the age. The campaign was not a reckless surge of vengeance. It was methodical. Mongol armies advanced in multiple columns, crossing deserts and mountains in separate directions while maintaining communication. Cities that expected a single frontal assault instead faced attackers appearing from unexpected horizons. Bokhara fell first. Chroniclers recorded Genghis Khan addressing the population, declaring that resistance had brought ruin upon them. Samarkand followed soon after, despite its formidable defenses. In some places, surrender was accepted. Skilled artisans and administrators were spared, incorporated into the expanding empire. In others, resistance triggered annihilation. Entire populations were slaughtered, and the devastation was deliberate. This selective brutality was not uncontrolled savagery. It was calculated messaging. Cities that resisted were destroyed publicly and decisively. Survivors were allowed to flee, carrying stories of total ruin across trade routes. Those stories traveled faster than Mongol cavalry. Neighboring towns faced a stark choice: submit and survive, or defy and vanish. Increasingly, gates opened before siege engines were even assembled. Rulers weighed the cost of resistance against the certainty of destruction and chose survival. By the time the campaign concluded in 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire had collapsed with astonishing speed. Its cities, once confident in walls and numbers, had been undone as much by terror as by tactics. The Mongols had proven that fear could reduce the need for prolonged warfare. They did not need to fight every battle if reputation could fight in advance. From this point forward, conquest accelerated not only because of cavalry and coordination, but because the world began to believe that resistance was hopeless. Fear had become an independent force, riding ahead of the army and preparing the ground before the first arrow was ever loosed. If terror shattered cities, it was precision on the battlefield that shattered armies. Among the Mongols' most devastating tools was the feigned retreat, a tactic so simple in appearance that many commanders mistook it for weakness. The maneuver began like any conventional engagement. Mongol cavalry advanced in loose formation, loosing volleys of arrows to probe the enemy's strength. Then, at a chosen moment, not when overwhelmed, but when the rhythm of battle favored them, they turned and withdrew. To opposing forces trained in rigid formations and decisive charges, this looked like collapse. Victory seemed within reach. Orders to pursue were shouted with confidence. The pursuit was exactly what the Mongols intended. As armored cavalry surged forward and infantry struggled to keep pace, cohesion began to fracture. Units outran their commanders. Communication dissolved amid dust and noise. The once solid line stretched thin across unfamiliar terrain. Meanwhile, Mongol riders maintained spacing even in apparent flight. They continued firing backward from their saddles with unnerving accuracy, slowing and harassing their pursuers without breaking formation. What appeared to be panic was controlled withdrawal. The pattern unfolded dramatically in 1223 at the Khalkha River. Mongol generals Subutai and Jebe engaged a coalition of Rus princes and their Kuman allies. After initial clashes, the Mongols withdrew, drawing the coalition into a prolonged pursuit that lasted days. Confident in their numerical advantage, the Rus commanders pressed forward, unaware that they were being measured, distance, fatigue, and terrain carefully calculated. When the Mongols turned to fight, they did so on ground of their choosing. Hidden reserves struck from the flanks. The pursuing army, exhausted and disorganized, found itself encircled. Panic spread quickly. Leaders were targeted first, further accelerating confusion. The coalition collapsed into isolated pockets of resistance and was destroyed. This was not mere trickery. It demanded extraordinary discipline. A retreat risks becoming real if soldiers lose nerve. But Mongol units trusted their structure and command. They knew reinforcement was waiting beyond sight. Their enemies, driven by pride and the instinct to exploit apparent weakness, often defeated themselves. The battlefield became psychological terrain. The Mongols understood that armies conditioned to equate retreat with defeat could not resist pursuit. By manipulating that assumption, they transformed expectation into vulnerability. Power alone did not secure victory. Fear and miscalculation did the rest. By 1241, Europe stood on the edge of a confrontation it barely understood. News of Mongol victories in the east had filtered through fragmented reports, armies destroyed, princes killed, cities burned, but distance bred disbelief. Many European rulers assumed the devastation was exaggerated or confined to distant lands. When Mongol forces under the command of Subutai and Batik Khan advanced into Poland and Hungary, the reality of that misunderstanding became clear. On April 9, 1241, at the Battle of Legnica in Poland, a coalition of European knights, including forces from Silesia and the Teutonic Order, assembled to halt the invasion. The knights were heavily armored, disciplined in the traditions of shock cavalry, and confident in their martial reputation. The Mongols engaged briefly, exchanging arrows before appearing to withdraw. To European commanders, this signaled weakness. Cavalry charges followed, lances lowered, banners pushing forward in pursuit. But the withdrawal was deliberate. Mongol units maintained cohesion while retreating, drawing the coalition into disarray. At a calculated moment, they turned and struck. Smoke screens obscured vision. Arrows targeted commanders first. Units that had surged ahead found themselves isolated. The coalition collapsed under coordinated assault. Just 2 days later, on April 11, a far larger confrontation unfolded at the Battle of Mohi in Hungary. King Bela IV believed his forces were protected by the natural barrier of the Sajo River. The Mongols initially attacked the main bridge, fixing Hungarian attention forward. Meanwhile, under cover of darkness, another Mongol contingent constructed a bridge downstream. When battle resumed, Hungarian troops faced assault from multiple directions. Some Mongol units feigned retreat once again, luring segments of the Hungarian army into exposed terrain. Others closed in from flanks and rear, completing the encirclement. Panic spread rapidly among troops unaccustomed to such fluid maneuvering. European armies were structured around feudal loyalty and rigid formations. Once cohesion fractured, recovery was difficult. Heavy armor that symbolized strength became a liability against fast-moving horse archers. Commanders struggled to regain control as signals were lost in dust and chaos. The Mongols did not simply defeat Europe's armies with superior numbers. They dismantled them by exploiting pride, momentum, and expectation. Fear multiplied the effect. Survivors carried stories of sudden reversals and annihilation across the continent, reinforcing a reputation that often weakened resistance before the next battle even began. By the mid-13th century, the Mongols had discovered that fear could achieve what prolonged sieges and costly assaults could not. Their reputation began to function as an invisible vanguard, weakening cities before the army even appeared on the horizon. Word of annihilated populations in Central Asia and Eastern Europe spread along the Silk Road and through refugee accounts. Merchants carried tales of entire urban centers erased for defiance. Survivors described walls breached, rulers executed, and resistance crushed without mercy. Whether every detail was accurate mattered less than the cumulative effect. Fear reshaped decision-making at every level of leadership. This psychological weapon was not applied blindly. Mongol commanders made careful distinctions between cities that surrendered quickly and those that resisted. When a city opened its gates and submitted, it was often spared mass destruction. Local administrators were retained, taxes imposed, and life resumed under Mongol authority. Skilled craftsmen, engineers, and scholars were frequently protected and relocated where their talents could serve the empire. But if a city resisted, especially after being offered terms, the response was often devastating. Mass executions were carried out publicly. Survivors were allowed to flee, intentionally spreading the consequences of defiance. Terror was selective, and therefore credible. This strategy reduced the need for constant brute force. Instead of fighting prolonged battles against every stronghold, Mongol armies often found gates opening at their approach. Governors weighed their options: resist and risk obliteration, or surrender and preserve their population. Increasingly, the rational choice was submission. In this way, fear shortened campaigns and accelerated expansion. Entire regions capitulated without extensive combat because leaders understood the pattern. The Mongols also understood the power of symbolism. The destruction of prominent cities resonated beyond their walls. When a major center fell, its collapse reverberated across neighboring territories, shaking confidence in traditional defenses. The message was clear: fortifications alone would not save you. Numbers alone would not protect you. Resistance carried catastrophic risk. Fear, then, became a multiplier. It reduced the cost of conquest, conserved manpower, and allowed Mongol forces to move swiftly to the next objective. Power still mattered, armies still fought, sieges still occurred, but terror often did the initial work. The Mongols had learned that domination could begin in the mind long before it unfolded on the battlefield. By the time Hulagu Khan advanced into the heart of the Islamic world, the Mongol reputation was already entrenched in fear. Yet the siege of Baghdad in 1258 would elevate that fear into something almost apocalyptic. The Abbasid capital was not merely a city, it was a symbol of political and religious authority, a center of scholarship and wealth that had stood for centuries. Many believed its status alone would protect it. But the Mongols did not recognize symbolic immunity. When diplomatic demands for submission were rejected, Hulagu prepared for a full assault. The siege was methodical. Mongol forces encircled the city, cutting off escape and supply routes. Engineers, many of them drawn from earlier conquests in China and Persia, constructed advanced siege engines capable of battering even formidable walls. Artillery pounded defenses while cavalry sealed the perimeter. Within weeks, Baghdad's fortifications were breached. The caliph's authority, once thought unassailable, proved powerless against coordinated assault and disciplined execution. What followed sent shockwaves across the medieval world. Contemporary accounts describe widespread destruction and immense loss of life. Libraries and institutions that symbolized centuries of intellectual achievement were devastated. Whether later chroniclers exaggerated details or not, the perception of catastrophe was undeniable. The fall of Baghdad signaled that no city, however sacred or historically significant, was beyond reach. This destruction was not random rage. It reinforced a strategic message that had defined Mongol expansion for decades: defiance carried irreversible consequences. For rulers across the Middle East and beyond, Baghdad's fate became a warning. Submission meant incorporation into the empire's system. Resistance meant annihilation. The psychological impact far exceeded the immediate battlefield outcome. Yet even as terror solidified Mongol dominance, it carried risk. An empire built in part on fear required constant demonstration of strength to maintain credibility. If fear weakened, resistance could re-emerge. The siege of Baghdad represented the peak of this strategy, an unmistakable display of total war. It proved that the Mongols did not merely defeat armies. They could dismantle civilizations. And in doing so, they ensured that their reputation would ride ahead of them long after the smoke had cleared. In the end, the Mongols did not conquer through strength alone. Many empires possessed large armies, advanced weapons, and fortified cities. What set the Mongols apart was their understanding that fear could move faster than cavalry. From the steppes of Mongolia to the walls of Baghdad, they mastered the art of shaping perception before battle ever began. They annihilated selectively, spared strategically, and allowed survivors to carry stories that weakened the resolve of the next city in their path. Entire regions surrendered not because they had been defeated, but because they believed defeat was inevitable. Yet fear, while powerful, was not infinite. It required constant reinforcement. When internal divisions emerged after the death of great Khans, and when campaigns slowed, the aura of inevitability began to fade. The empire endured for generations, but the momentum of unstoppable expansion did not. Still, in the span of a few decades, the Mongols reshaped continents. They demonstrated that psychological warfare could compress time, collapsing resistance before swords ever crossed. They did not conquer because they were invincible. They conquered because they were understood too late.